Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This is season 3, episode 11 of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Today's guest is Sue Leather. Sue is a UK ELT consultant, teacher, editor and author, now based in Vancouver. She runs an educational consultancy group, Sue Leather Associates, specializing in teacher and trainer education. Sue co-founded EVE, Equal Voices in ELT, an initiative that was created to recognize both gender and highly proficient speaker parity in keynote and plenary lineups for ELT conferences and events worldwide. Sue is also an expert in extensive reading, sometimes called learner literature. She's written over 40 original graded readers, and she is the author of Extensive Reading, The Role of Motivation 2021. Great chat with Sue, and I hope you enjoy the podcast as always.
Hey everyone, buckle up for a new episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast, the one and only podcast made to help you launch your business or take your existing business to a level of success you could never have imagined. Whether you're a school owner, freelancer, publisher, or other entrepreneur, you're sure to pick up lots of actionable advice when you listen to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Remember to visit eflmagazine.com for great articles and features. Without further ado, here's your host, the founder of EFL Magazine, Philip Pound.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the latest episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. And I'm delighted today to have our guest, Sue Leather from... well, actually living now in Vancouver, Canada, but where are you from originally, Sue?
So I'm originally from the UK, as you can probably hear from my accent. I'm from about 10 miles out of Manchester, so I'm a northerner.
Okay, and how long have you been living in Canada, in Vancouver?
So we came over in 2004, and so that's 18 years now. And before that, I lived in the Netherlands, in The Hague, for about 3 years. And then before that, I was in Cambridge in the UK, and I'd been there for quite a long time. So, so we've been over here a long time now.
Okay, so tell me about growing up in Manchester.
Growing up in Manchester. So we lived... in a small mill town called Royton. It's not far from Oldham. And actually it was a really, really nice, very quiet sort of childhood. I had one sister, a younger sister. Most exciting thing, I suppose, was that my dad travelled a lot for work when I was a kid. So there were long periods of time, especially when I was smaller, when he was away, in far-flung places, and that had its challenges, I think, for the whole family. But it did give me a penchant for travel, and I always thought it was what must be a wonderful thing to go to all these exotic places. So that was the most kind of exciting thing, I think, about my childhood. But otherwise, it was pretty normal sort of working class upbringing. Went to a grammar school, went to a girls' school, went to university in Leeds, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so you left the mill town. So on your what would we say? You live. It's Royston. It's a mill town originally. It's
Royton.
Oh, so Royton. Sorry.
Royton. Yeah. There is a Royston, but it's down near Cambridge. It is a mill town. I think it actually had the first powered cotton mill in the country back in the 1800s.
Oh.
And it's not a particularly beautiful town, but it's set in the southern Pennines. So, I grew up near the moors, and quite nice surroundings. We had countryside around us.
I think Royston, wasn't that in the League of Gentlemen? Or one of those? Possibly. Yeah, I'm thinking of, sure. Yeah. It's Is that the one where they did the blackface and it's probably not politically correct in our current environment, but that's it. So you went over to Leeds, and I'm pretty familiar with Leeds, having lived in Hull for a few years. So how about Leeds? Did you like university there?
I did actually. I studied modern languages. I studied Spanish and French. I got the chance to spend a year abroad in Spain, in Salamanca, which was brilliant. Worked as an assistant teacher at a state school, a girls' school again. I was in girls' schools, and I spent 3 months in France at the Sorbonne in Paris. That was really nice, and so yeah, it was great.
Okay, great.
Really enjoyed it. Spent a couple of years in Spain in all.
And tell me about Salamanca. How is
Well, it's a long time since I was there. So I was there the year that Franco died. So,
Oh,
yeah, it's a long time ago. So that was one of the most exciting things about it. So that was 1973, was it?
75, or was that 75, 70, was it 76 was Mao, was it, or 75? And Franco was probably early 70s, wasn't it? And then, yeah.
So he when I arrived in Spain in the October of that year, he was very ill and in hospital, and he died, I think, in the November. And so Salamanca, which is a big university town, there was a feeling of great excitement, the fact that he was about to die. And there were demonstrations and stuff when he did die, for amnesty and all that kind of thing. So it was a kind of exciting time to be there. It was politically very, very exciting. And because it was a university town, I was living with people who were university people, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was quite good, really. Quite enjoyed it. A beautiful city. Haven't been there for many years, but really lovely.
So it would be akin to probably 1989 in Europe for people who were born a little bit later. And what was the transition like? Was it violent, non-violent demonstrations was it seamless? How did it go?
I think there were some, you had to be very careful in the demonstrations because people were, it was the day of the riot police. They had the grises, they were called, and they wore these grey uniforms, and they were pretty handy with the truncheons, and they were certainly taking people into jail cells, and there were rumours of torture and all kinds of stuff. So you had to have your wits about you. And I believe, obviously in different areas of the country, in the Basque Country, Catalonia, etc., there was quite a lot of trouble. But so yeah, it was an exciting time.
Okay, and then you came back to the UK, came back to Leeds. You completed your studies, and did you decide then to go into English language teaching, or did you have a proper career before that?
No. Well, what happened was that I was in the Spanish department at Leeds, and there was a fellow who was there. He was an older student. It's called John Fitzgibbon, and he had lived in Spain for many, many, many years. He'd never taken a degree in Spanish, spoke fluent Spanish, was married to a Spanish woman, and he owned a language school in Madrid. So when I finished my degree, I went out to Madrid and thought, I'll try and find a job. And I knocked on John Fitzgibbon's door, and he gave me a job. Quite unlikely, really, but at that time I didn't have any qualifications. I got them later. So I started off pretty soon teaching English in a language school in Madrid. And I just fell into it because it was I got a job and it was a convenient thing to do. Found that I enjoyed it, came back to the UK, went to Cambridge and qualified.
Okay, and you qualified. So when you told me a little bit earlier that you were in Spain at the time of Franco's
Yeah,
death, I was like, oh, I know. Did Franco die in the 70s? So I,
yeah,
looking at you, I wouldn't think you were, because I was born in 75. So you
yeah,
were actually, in university when I was not even born. Yeah,
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 yeah. You're very, very old.
yeah. So no, that's not what I was saying. You don't look like you don't look as a person who would been in university in 1972. So, um, the good life, the good food, maybe in Canada. I don't know
That must
the
be it. That must be
yeah,
it.
pollution-free environment. But okay, so you came back, you qualified, and then did you go to The Hague after that, or were you teaching in
No, no,
UK?
I was teaching in Cambridge for a long time. I worked as a teacher in various schools, and then I got a job as a director, as a teacher in a school in Girton near Cambridge. And then after a few years of that, I was promoted to director of studies. Um, I was director of studies of that school for about 13 years, I think. And then I left and I went to IH London as I think my title was Director of English or something like that. Um, so I went to IH, uh, commuted from Cambridge. It was a bit of a culture shock. I stayed there, I think, about 2 years at IH, and then I left and went freelance. So, so I've been freelance since 1995.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Yeah. So you went as a freelance teacher, consultant, what,
Yeah,
writer?
I I didn't know what I was going to do at first, but I quickly got. I'd always networked a lot. I was quite involved in ITEFL. I knew a lot of people, and so somebody offered me a job training in Belgrade in Serbia on a Kote course or something like that, and a teacher training course. So I went out there for a couple of months. And then I just started reinventing myself, if you like, as a teacher trainer. I'd always done some teacher training throughout my career, on CELTA courses and Delta courses and all that kind of stuff. So I sort of went from management. I'd been in management, and then I went back to teacher training, and that was my main bread and butter for a few years, and then I started to take on more, consultancy projects, and branched out a bit.
Okay, so you were 12, 13 years in IH, and you decided
No,
then,
only a couple of years in IH.
oh,
So
okay,
13 years at Cambridge Academy in Cambridge,
okay,
and then a couple of years in London.
okay.
Yeah,
Yes, I should have listened better. It is early in the
no,
morning for me. As I said,
no,
it's only
there's
like 10 a.m.
lots of numbers going around, and I've had rather a long career, so it's still kind of, lots of things going on.
So let's say 15 years you were working for somebody else. Was
Yeah.
it all that time you said, well, I'd really like to become a freelancer. Really like to work for myself, and you were networking in that time, or was it it just evolved over time? You said, well, maybe I'd like to do something else. How did that happen?
It just evolved. I mean, I truly loved working. I worked for a school called the Cambridge Academy in Girton. It was owned by a Japanese educational company. It was a lovely school, and I loved being director of studies of it. It was a great environment. I got a chance to go to Japan a couple of times and meet with the people there, and I really loved it. But I was a little bit ambitious, and I wanted to move up, as it were, in management. It's quite interested in management. Got this job at IH in London, which I also enjoyed. Things changed at IH, and I was not really part of those changes. I mean, there were a few of us who were not part of those changes. And so I had a choice. I could either look for another job, or I could just go out into the world and see whatever. And so I had a bit of time to think about it. And as I was thinking about it, somebody phoned me, as I say, and said, would you like to go to Belgrade for a couple of months and do this training course? And I thought, well, I haven't got anything better to do. So, and it'd be good to make a bit of money. So off I went. And I found that I really liked it. And I thought, well, maybe I can be freelance. You know, people want to employ me. I've got the teacher training background. I've got this management background. I knew how to do certain things. So I kind of just moved into it like that. And I found after a while that I really, really enjoyed it. I thought, oh, this is much better than working for somebody else and having to go out to work every day. And, you know, so I enjoyed it.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier about networking. So was that a deliberate thing, or are you naturally like a social butterfly? I mean, what was your, how did you network?
I'm not sure that I'm a social butterfly. I think most people close to me would say that I'm not very outgoing at all, really. I'm quite a private person. But I did enjoy my career, and I enjoyed going to conferences, and I had various groups that I was in Women in TEFL, and I was part of TEFL, and I started the Director of Studies organization in Cambridge, and I started the ELT management group of IATEFL. So I knew people, and people knew me because of all these activities. And so I didn't have a plan in mind when I was networking. You know, I didn't know that in the future I would be freelance, but it just happened that I knew a lot of people, and luckily people were willing to give me a job. So, you know, it worked out. And I must say that at the time I still don't really have any dependents. I have a partner who is, you know, we depended on each other, if you like, but, you know, I didn't have children, or I think it's a bit more difficult going freelance if you have kids, you have dependents. You know, because it's a bit more unsure when the pay packet is going to come in. But for me, I loved it.
Yeah, it suits you. So tell me a little bit about English teaching in the 70s, 80s, 90s, because, you know, now, of course, we've got technology, neoliberalism, zero-hour contracts, and of course, we've got other pressures with, you know, COVID and wars. So what was it like? Was it a well-paid job back then? Was the salary competitive versus like state sector or, you know, private sector, non-education?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that it was ever that well paid. I always managed, as I say, I didn't have dependents, so I always was responsible for myself. I mean, I loved it. I loved the contact with different cultures, and I loved the materials. And I think that there's always been a kind of cutting edge to materials in ELT. I mean, I remember using things like developing strategies, you know, Brian Abs, you know, going back in the day. But they, you know, they had things like single parents in them, and you know, it was, you could talk about things with students that were, I know these days things have moved on quite a lot, and we're now talking about, you know, all kinds of sexuality and gender and all these kinds of things. It wasn't quite that advanced in those days, but it was still advanced in terms of perhaps what you could do with school children. So I enjoyed that. I enjoyed teaching adults and teenagers and being able to talk to them about all kinds of stuff. As to whether it was well paid, I don't know. I don't think so. When I became DOS and then head of English, then I was better paid. But before that, not particularly.
Yeah, I just say that because the experience here, well, I wasn't here in Japan in the 80s, but for friends that, were teaching and directors of studies or in universities, uh, they were getting pay increases of 10 to 15% year on year.
Yeah,
And, they could buy houses with cash. They didn't have to look at prices. And this was during a boom economy in Tokyo in the 1980s. So Japan was really the place to be for, an English language
yeah.
teacher. And you said you came to Japan just around then, did you?
I came to meet because the school that I worked at was owned by this Japanese educational company. They've got two women's colleges in Gifu, and I came to talk to them and to see them and to visit and all that kind of stuff. And I stayed for about 6 weeks, and I stayed with a Japanese family in Gifu, which was great. Really had a wonderful time. I learned some Japanese and really enjoyed it. And then the second time was when I was IH, and they sent me to Japan. We had a big contract with them, with one of the universities. Can't even remember the university now in Tokyo. And I went to talk to them just for a few days. And then the third time I went was when I was freelance just a few years ago. And I was working with Rob Waring and Julian Tomlinson, and we went to Rob's house. Can't remember where it is now. It'll come back to me. We went to his house, and the three of us had a meeting there, we were developing the page turner series for Cengage. I've been about 3 times and enjoyed it every time. And actually, I wrote my MA dissertation on training teachers, Western teachers, to teach Japanese learners. I became very, very interested in that whole area because at the school that I worked in Cambridge, in Girton, in Cambridge, we had a lot of Japanese students from this college in Gifu. And teachers, although they were gorgeous, they were really nice kids and everything, it was a bit of a challenge sometimes for teachers to teach them because of the way they'd been trained, etc. So I got really, really interested in it, and actually wrote a book about it with Peter Gray, and did my MA dissertation on it. So, I've always been interested in Japan.
So please do impart some insights on teaching Japanese students.
I've got the book here somewhere.
Oh, please do feel free to plug the book as well.
Oh, I'm not sure. I think it is still in print, but it's called Safety and Challenge. And we came up with some interesting, quite unusual ideas, let's say, that we tried out in our classrooms in Japan, in Girton. I think working with Japanese women as women teachers, the two of us who wrote this book were women teachers. And so we were able, I suppose, to do things that maybe be more difficult for men to do. So we did get them speaking a lot louder. For example, that was one of the issues. I mean, it seems very I don't know. We should, in a sense, we should let people be as they are. But we found that the young women living in Girton were having difficulty communicating in the environment because one of the things was they just weren't speaking loud enough. So they would go into stores and things like that, and people wouldn't be able to hear them. So we're working on things like that, and we also got them out into the environment quite a lot. So we had them on kind of mixed programs where they were doing some work in the classroom in the morning, and then they'd go out in the afternoon and they'd do things like visit at the old folks' home, because we worked in a little village, a little Cambridgeshire village. So they would go there, or they would go and help out in shops, or they would, we got people in the community to work with them so that they could actually, instead of learning, just learning grammar in the classroom, they'd be doing a bit of classroom learning, then going out and actually using English to communicate with people in the environment. And we did a lot of work on that. We ran conferences on it. I think we were quite well known for it at the time. We ran our own teaching Japanese learners, day conferences, and taught the community in the UK quite a lot about how to deal with Japanese learners.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. That was very helpful. It's always a challenge. I think I've had a lot of teachers ask me the same question, and when I attended conferences with my wife as well, she was say, "Can you tell me something about what Japanese mean when they say this, or what taboos with Japanese, how to get them to speak, how to get them to express their ideas." So any pointers in that direction is always helpful for listeners. So we'll move on. So after that, you tell me about moving to The Hague and then eventually to Canada.
So I moved to The Hague to live with my partner, and the UK was part of England was part of the EU at that time, so I could work there. And I did a lot of business training, because that's the business in Holland. There's a lot of business training to be done. So I did a lot of working with people giving presentations. I did some work with universities, with their teachers who had to teach. They weren't English teachers, but they had to teach through the medium of English. So I would do teacher training courses with them. Very, very busy. And at the same, so I did a lot of work there. And then I was traveling out to particularly former Yugoslavia at that time, doing a lot of teacher training, writing original readers, very busy time really. So I was there for 3 years. And then we thought, well, we don't want to actually, my partner's American, so we didn't really want to necessarily settle in The Hague, although it was very nice. Property is very expensive. So we thought we might look at Canada. We had friends who moved over here, and we came to visit, and we thought we'd like to live here. So we came over and bought a house. I sold my apartment in Cambridge, which I've been renting out, and we bought a house here on the Sunshine Coast, and never looked back.
Fantastic. And so people say, teaching English in the Netherlands, teaching English in Holland, teaching English in The Hague, that's quite easy. All the Dutch can speak English, can't they?
Yeah, they can. I mean, you would go in, it was difficult to learn Dutch. I tried learning some Dutch and I succeeded to a certain extent, but you'd go into the local supermarket and, the 19-year-old young woman at the cash desk I'd try something in Dutch and she would speak back to me in pretty perfect English. So it was really hard to learn Dutch or to practice Dutch.
That's not a problem here in Japan, by the way. Sorry, go on.
No. Having said that, in certain contexts, so for example, my partner did a lot of work. We both actually did a lot of work helping people to give presentations because, for example, there were scientists who had to go around the world really, but particularly the EU, and to give their presentations in English. And their English sounds pretty good, But, they still need quite a lot of work in actual delivery and vocabulary and all those kinds of things. And the same with the teachers that I was working with, although they could speak English, they weren't really very fluent when they were teaching. But yeah, it's an interesting context. I mean, if you go to an English language teaching conference in Holland, most of it, the ones I went to anyway, most of it's held in Dutch, because basically their English is, it's not a big problem for them to speak English, so they don't see that they have to speak English at the conference. But it's they speak good English. It's a bit Dutch English sometimes. They need a bit of work on this and that. But and also the intercultural stuff is quite interesting, because the Dutch are much more, for example, much more direct than the English are. So if they're doing business with the English, it's perhaps best to understand where they're coming from.
That's true. It's like that page, isn't it? What is it's on Twitter, isn't it? The British problems page, the one with the umbrella. Yeah. What's it called?
Yeah, British problems.
British problems, yeah. It's that's being direct. Dutch, Germans generally we think is being direct, and Russians as well, isn't it? So, yeah. But Japanese, of course, are at the other end of the scale, aren't they? So it's always interesting.
A bit of intercultural training. Quite a bit actually, with Dutch companies that were doing business with other countries. So that was a lucrative source of income for us actually when we were in the Netherlands.
And I didn't mention, so we just reel back a little bit there, is we'll talk a little bit about your writing. So how that started. I know you mentioned a little bit about your meeting with Rob Waring here in Japan, but how did you start with writing? You first started writing course materials and then moved to fiction, or you were always a fiction writer since, small girl, or how did that happen?
Well, yeah, I've always written a bit, but in terms of ELT, I wrote my own materials, like most teachers do. And then I wrote a book when I was at the academy, sort of early 80s, I think. I wrote a book for Oxford University Press in the Bookworm series called Desert Mountain Sea. And it's three stories of, it's kind of faction. They're true stories of women who did very adventurous things like going across the Australian desert and stuff. And I got that published, and which was fine. And then one day I lived in Cambridge, and Philip Prowse contacted me and said, I'm thinking of starting this series with Cambridge University Press, and I think you'd be interested and good at it. And we're looking for people to write original fiction. And we're looking to do kind of pilot fiction for this series. So I actually had a story in my head, because I had a couple of stories in my head. I had trained in karate for about 10 years. And so I had a number of stories about the karate world in my head. And then I knew a person who there was a famous case in England, in London, in the 60s, where a fellow called James Hanratty was arrested and then subsequently convicted and hanged for murder. And I knew an older fellow who had been the journalist who was the first person on the scene of the crime that he was supposed to have committed. And so I read his notes and I read a book about it and all kinds of stuff. And I became very interested in this in this story, because everything I read led me to believe that this fellow was not guilty. And I've always been interested in miscarriages of justice. Anyway, so if you're following me, these two things came together in my head, this kind of karate world and this story about James Hanratty. And so I wrote a story called Death in the Dojo. And Cambridge University printed it first as a pilot, and then they printed it in the series. And then I just started writing fiction, learner literature. First of all, for Cambridge University Press in this series with Philip Rouse as the series editor, and then I got involved with Page Turners and Cengage and all that kind of thing.
Okay, so it started from there. So tell me about writing ELT materials back then, because nowadays and has been for a number of years is people talk about more inclusive texts, more progressive texts, with current events and to prompt social change in some way. So what were the books like back then? How have they progressed? How do you see ELT books being in the future, and taking into account parsnips as well, which I think people don't really talk about so much now. I think that was something people talked about 5-10 years ago. So with all of that, all of those ingredients, can you make a nice dish from that? Can you tell me what?
I was thinking about this recently, because there was back in the, I don't know, late 80s, early 90s, I don't know when. It's a book called Taboos and Issues. I don't know.
I do know it well. Yeah, I have it here actually. Yeah.
And I wrote a review. Of that book, and I had it here recently. But anyway, I loved that book. I used to use that in Holland quite a lot with teachers and advanced students. And in Holland, sort of anything goes. So
that's why I loved Holland, visiting in the late 80s, growing up in Ireland and like a conservative country, and then go to Holland, everything was free and everybody, you can be what you want to be. Nobody even looks at you. It's, that in Amsterdam, isn't it? You can walk down the street, wear whatever you want. Nobody cares. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that book looks very old-fashioned now, but at the time when it came out, it was really, really good. And you could approach these issues, I don't know, homosexuality or death penalty or whatever, and talk about them. Publishing learner literature, obviously, there are things which are on the list which you can't kind of approach, right? So, but I did manage to talk about, miscarriages of justice quite a lot. So the things that I was interested in, I did manage to get in. There are just some things like, sex was obviously out. I always threatened that I was going to write a level 1 reader about a man who couldn't have sex because he was only level 1, this kind of stuff. So you learn to work around it. And I actually I find the confines actually quite freeing, because if you can write about anything, it's actually quite difficult. It's much easier to write, to write within a certain box, if you like.
As all artists, sonnet forms or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, I think that the landscape is really interesting now, and that people are, bringing out these questions of identity and, talking about who we really are in the classroom, and about, hidden voices or invisible voices or whatever it is. That, I mean, we've always had people who are different in our classrooms. We've always had people who are of different kind of backgrounds and sexualities and genders. All this has always existed. And I think it's really wonderful that we're starting to kind of open that out and talk about it, or at least in certain contexts. I mean, I think the challenging thing for ELT, as we know, is that it's a very broad world. And, what we can talk about in Holland or in England is quite different from what we can talk about in Japan or, Saudi Arabia or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's all to be looked at very carefully. But I find it, interesting. And a couple of years back, I did some writing for a project for UAE, and that was intensely challenging because, it was almost, it just seemed extraordinarily difficult. And in fact, I did it and I thought, I can't do this again, because you can't have, for example, girls who ride bicycles, or you can't have girls doing things, or women kind of,
existing. Sorry, no, I had to say that. I'm a bit overcritical, but there you go. Yeah, that is very challenging, and we have to tailor our teaching to the environment and the people that are in the classroom. I think a lot of people pushing for change in textbooks. It's really for the audience and the people they hang around with, isn't it? I mean, there's texts you can't use in other countries.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. It's a huge world, and this is what I think happens sometimes on Twitter. People or on social media in general, I suppose. People are talking about the classroom. And as Widdowson, I think, said many years ago when talking about communicative language teaching, there is not one classroom. There are millions, literally millions and millions of classrooms all over the globe. And, there are all different rules about what you could do there. But in general, I think pushing the rules is a good thing.
And funny you should mention Taboos and Issues. It's a book I like as well. I mean, as you say, it is dated. I mean, I don't know when it was written. I'll just have a look here. It was probably late 80s. It kind of feels like, doesn't it? I'm not sure. 2001. Okay, well, this one was 2001. But I've seen some people on social media actually criticize this book now. It reminds me of, I don't know if you've seen recently, there's a documentary on the BBC about Mary Whitehouse.
Oh, no, I haven't seen it.
It's definitely
but I heard of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But actually, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when Alf Garnett was on TV and there was Rising Damp, all these programs were kind of pushing these social issues and racism, homophobia.
Oh, yeah.
And she was criticizing these programs at the time. And the BBC Director General, they came to blows, and he eventually had to resign. But it's kind of come full circle now that people are trying to cancel Alf Garnett and Fawlty Towers for different reasons.
Yeah. Yes, it's
originally it was against racism, but now they're saying it's racist.
Yeah, it's. I think if you live long enough on the planet, everything will come round 2 or 3 times. And it's part of change, and I think each generation has got to reinvent things the way they see them, and it's all good, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. And even looking at this, I mean, the Taboos and Issues, for example, some of the chapters are still relevant, and they're, they're provocative, torture, sex for sale, all these things, you wouldn't use them in every classroom. But I think one of the chapters was gays and jobs. Yes. I mean, that just shows really how we've moved on, that's not even an issue anymore, is it?
Yeah. And
the
whole idea of people being a taboo or an issue is, it's. But at the time, it was really, really innovative, and it's to be redone.
Yeah, I can imagine. From growing up in Ireland, and I think up until 1983, it was like, homosexuality was, it was illegal. Yeah. And then, of course, we didn't have marriage equality till 2016, but things just, a complete sea change in the whole country. It's and I'm happy I've lived through it, but it's going full circle again, I think. But we won't get into the politics. We'll move on a little bit. So you moved to Canada. Tell me about your current projects that you have. I know you're involved in Eve mentoring. So tell me about Eve. So my understanding of what Eve is, it's about gender balance for speakers at conferences. But is it more than that?
A little bit more than that. So it originally, we started it in 2017, I think it was. And the idea was we want to promote gender balance, but also L1 speaker, L2 speaker balance. So what has been called in the past native speaker, non-native speaker, but we don't like to use that term. So those two things, gender and L1, L2. And in order to do that, conferences contact us and they say, we're running this conference, have a look at the plenary lineup. We've got a balance, we think we deserve some credit. And so we look at it and then we give conferences badges. So, you get a purple badge for gender balance, you get a green badge for L1, L2 balance, and you get a platinum badge if you manage to do both. Okay, so that was very popular, especially at first. Conferences were dying to get these badges and they'd put them on their conference website and we would put them on our calendar. Okay, so we did that, and then so that was kind of a bit top down. So we decided that we'd like to start doing something more bottom up. And so we started mentoring programs. So in 2021, before that, I talked to somebody called Amira Salama, who is now the president, the chair of Africa ELTA. And she was very interested in mentoring. And we cooked up a plan to run a pilot program between Eve and Africa ELTA. So I think we worked with 7 or 8 mentees from Africa ELTA. They were classroom teachers who were talented and they put in applications and they wanted to become conference speakers. And we found some mentors in our networks. We put it out on our social media and said, look, we want some women, in the first place, mentors to mentor these women. And so we got a fantastic response from the ELT community. I mean, people who, famous speakers, Sarah Mercer, Marjorie Rosenberg, these kinds of people, wanting to give back. I think that the thing is that people, especially of my generation now, we're of an age where we're kind of done most of the work we're probably going to do, and we want to give back to the community. So we had this fantastic response, and we ran a pilot program. Worked really, really well. We ran it again this past year, and we also ran one with ELTAM in North Macedonia. And right now we're going to start another one with Latin American Caribbean TESOL. And so, and part of this kind of thing, so we're going to run, with basically anybody who wants to run a program with us in order to bring up these women to become conference speakers nationally and then internationally. But in order to make it sustainable, what we're also doing is we're kind of getting people in the programs, we're getting people to shadow. So that, for example, now I just ran a program with ELTAM, North Macedonia, and 2 women, Maureen McGarvey and Charlotte Giller, they shadowed me, and they're now going to run the program with Latin American Caribbean. So we're also bringing men into the fold now, because we want our allies. We didn't mean to exclude men, but it seemed natural at first to work with women. But now we want to include allies as well. So the thing hopefully will grow out and will become sustainable, because there'll be plenty of people who'll be able to run the programs. And it's a simple thing. It's 6 to 9 hours of mentoring over a course of 3 or 4 months. I think the mentors always give a bit more than they are supposed to, in a sense. I mean, they form these fantastic relationships with the women, and in fact, go on to do more things. For example, Sarah Mercer went out to Kenya just recently to meet her mentee because she was so interested in what she was doing. So it's growing, and it's people are very enthusiastic about it.
Fantastic. And incorrectly, I said earlier, you're also interested in extensive writing, but of course, extensive reading, So tell me about your extensive reading projects, and because, there are some detractors for this idea, aren't there? Some people say...
Of extensive reading?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know, really. I think the jury has come back on extensive reading. I mean, I think that all the research basically points to the fact that it's a damn good thing, for language learning. Jez Uden and I just last year published this book, Extensive Reading, The Role of Motivation. It's in the Routledge Research and Resources.
And we'll have it in the show notes as well, Sue, so please feel free to send through all the links. And so sorry, please tell me about the book.
Yeah. So what we posited in this is that the missing link is motivation, obviously, to get teachers motivated and then to get students motivated. So it's basically sets out the research. It says what the implications of the research are, and then it gives about 60 activities linked to that research that you can actually do in the classroom and outside the classroom. And it's also got some training activities for teachers as well. So been working on that. I mean, I've written about 35 original stories, fiction. My particular thing is original work. I have adapted some things, but it's not really my great passion in life. I really like writing original stuff. So yes, it's still very much involved. In the past year, I've been writing a lot of mainstream fiction. So I've been moving over into writing my own short stories and thinking, working through ideas, possibly thinking about writing a novel. And, as I go into retirement, not immediately, but as I'm sort of moving in that direction, I want to be able to write more of my own stuff. So that's where my writing is going at the moment.
So when you first started writing, whether that be ELT books or fiction, the traditional publishing model was there, wasn't it? I mean, it was all print books. But now, of course, the barrier to entry in one way is lower because, you can self-publish. You can I even have a book on Amazon as well. But but also more difficulty is because maybe people are lost, aren't they? The book is almost anonymous among many other books. So for people starting to self-publish, or let's say go down the traditional route that you went down, what kind of tips can you give? I mean, is it just keep writing, keep publishing, get noticed, network, or what can people do?
I think I mean, I told you the story of how I got into writing. I mean, I just had I've always been interested in women's rights, etc., etc. I got into writing Desert Mountain Sea because I was interested in adventurous women. And I got into writing Death in the Dojo because I was interested in karate, and I was interested in people who had been hanged and were actually innocent, and so those interests feed into your work, and sometimes it's just a question of luck and a question of putting things together and keeping going until somebody notices. I think I don't know whether I've got anything better than that to say about it. I mean, I just think, if you've got something to say, keep saying it until you get noticed. That's certainly what I've done. And in fact, all writers have this. I had a case where I had a book that was rejected by the publisher, one of in the Cambridge series, and I published it somewhere else, and then I brought it back to Cambridge University Press, and I said, I think you should publish this, and eventually got it published, and it won the Extensive Reading Foundation Award.
Wow.
So, I think that, and there are loads of stories like this of really famous, not people like me, but really famous writers who've been rejected hundreds of times and, eventually get published and become world famous writers. So, I have self-published a bit as well. Sometimes I kind of play around with that, but I think for me, getting published, I think just the distribution, getting published and having a publisher behind you to distribute books is great. You don't have to then think about putting, having piles of books and putting them in packages and sending them out or whatever. So, yeah.
But even what would we say, the red brick publishers, if that's the right way to put it, or the traditional publishers, they've adopted a lot of the print to order model, haven't they? I know from one of the top publishers, actually the binding quality is not what it was. I'm not going to mention the publisher, but I bought a book a couple of years ago, and it was so much inferior to other books that I bought in the past from this publisher. And actually, somebody contacted me through Facebook who used to work for this company and said, "Well, sorry, but it's print to order now, and the quality is not so good." So that was my experience. But there's a general pressure, isn't there, on publishing?
Yeah, it seems so. I have published with very small publishers like ELT, Teacher to Writer, and I like these new things that are coming up. And I just published 3 stories with Readable. A fellow called Ziad Dajani is involved in it, and they're doing a nice job with the kind of app, Readable app. Because I've always thought readers should be on apps. So, I do like these very up-to-date things that are happening, and I'll try anything, to kind of, I like to spread things around a bit to see what works and to see but in the end, it's got to go out to a lot of people, because if you write something and you think it's good, then there's no point in having a distribution of 20 people. It's got to be, it's nice if it gets into a lot of hands. I think that's the thing that I think.
Okay, so the traditional route, get into a lot of hands. So just as somebody who went out on her own and went the freelancing route, you said already you didn't have children, you didn't have so many ties, you were, pretty financially stable. You said you had your own apartment in Cambridge. So, you could afford to do that. But for somebody who is in maybe management, teaching, they're looking to break out, whether that be in writing, entrepreneurship, what kind of advice can you give?
Great question. I have to say, when I went freelance, there weren't that many people who were freelance and doing what I was doing. And so I was quite lucky in that sense, that wasn't that. I mean, I've noticed in the past years that there's much more competition. I mean, if you look for an ELT consultant, for example, there are a lot of people out there doing ELT consultancy. So I think what I would advise is to find a niche that you're really interested in. I mean, eventually, I started teacher training because, that's what I knew how to do, and etc. But eventually I found my niche, which was, working on rather large projects in challenging circumstances, and became expert as much as one can in that. And so you get expertise, you get experience, and then people hear that you've done a good job on something, and then you get employed more, and I think that's it in the end. It's just working hard and trying to find a place where you are different from other people, or you can offer something or some kind of experience that other people don't have. And it might be a geographical area. For example, in the 90s, I became really expert in the former Yugoslavia because I spent a lot of time there and did lots of different things. So people knew that I knew something about that area, and so they're more likely to ask you than ask somebody who's never been there before. So it's all blood, sweat, and tears in the end. I mean, you have to work hard, I think, but finding a niche is really important.
Okay. And so we're almost winding it up for today. So if people want to work with you or work for you, or they want to partner in some way or more information, your website, which I'm going to put in the show notes, is SueLeatherAssociates.com. Actually, I was thinking before the show that your name is a little bit like a tongue twister. You could be Sue Leather, Shoe Leather. I don't know. That's my joke for today. But so you're also on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty much everywhere, so you can easily find me. My email address is sue@SueLeatherAssociates.com, and you can contact me that way.
Great. And Sue, thanks again.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast with Philip Pound. For more great advice and resources, check out EFLmagazine.com. If you found this podcast helpful, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.